Just as there are many different ideas we may have about who the Buddha was, so too do we find among the various schools of Buddhism many different versions of his life. Some of the biographical elements seem recognizably mundane or historical. They paint the picture of a human Buddha navigating life in Iron Age India. Other stories are clearly supernatural, involving miracles, ethereal beings from different realms, and covering inconceivably huge cosmic tracts of space and time. For our course, we will look at the Buddha's life from two different perspectives. First, in this video, we'll examine the traditional depiction of the Buddha's biography as found in the earliest surviving Buddhist literature, the Pali Canon. Then, in another video, we'll look a little more closely at some elements of his life, reading between the lines in the Pali Canon, to see if we can't further flesh out our picture of the Buddha in order to get a better sense for what kind of person he was, what kind of society he found himself in, and how he navigated the challenges that society presented him with. In other words, we will first look at the traditional, somewhat idealized biography of the Buddha. Then we will look at a more historically informed and naturalized perspective on the Buddha. Our goal isn't to say one view is better than the other. Rather, we can learn from both. The traditional biography highlights the Buddha as a supreme yogi and teacher. In that way, it gives us as practitioners faith and confidence in the Buddha's path. The naturalized biography, on the other hand, highlights how the awakened Buddha navigated the challenges of a human life in order to found and shepherd his order, while at the same time never manifesting any signs of greed, hatred, or delusion. The naturalized biography gives us, as practitioners, an example of how to embody our Dharma practice in our everyday lives, how to integrate our practice and our everyday lives, so that we can act wisely and lovingly to help make our world a better place. The traditional depiction of the Buddha's life found in the Pali Canon is nicely summarized in a book by Bhikkhu Nyanamoli called The Life of the Buddha, which is the book I'll be reading some excerpts from. So now it's story time. Feel free to pause the video, go get some hot chocolate or tea or a blanket to curl up with, or if you're on the beach, get yourself a nice frosted drink and relax. As long as the drink is non-alcoholic. This is a Buddhist class. I can't, suggest to go get a nice blended margarita or a nice Dos Equis and sit back and learn about the Buddha's life. This is a story about some degree of renunciation, so yes. So, thus have I heard. The Buddha's father was a great king named Suddhodana, lord of a land called Sakya on the Ganges plain in northeast central India. His mother was the Queen Maya. It is said that the Buddha lived countless lifetimes before his final birth as an unenlightened bodhisattva, a word which means a being in the process of awakening, or a Buddha to be. He's said to have spent these eons of lifetimes accumulating wisdom, meditative prowess, and ethically flawless behavior, so that in his final birth as a human, he would have accumulated enough merits to be in a position to become a completely awakened Buddha. Now, the king and queen desperately desired a child, an heir, but they had remained childless for 20 years into their marriage. However, one full moon night, while sleeping in the palace, the queen had a vivid dream. She felt herself being whisked away by 4 devas. Devas means angel-like celestial spirits, to a lake high in the Himalayas. These spirits, these devas, they bathed her in the lake, they clothed her in heavenly cloths, they anointed her with perfumes, they bedecked her with divine flowers, they bedazzled her. Soon after, a white elephant, holding a white lotus flower in its trunk, appeared, and it circled her 3 times. To circle someone was considered a sign of great respect in the Buddha's time. And then the elephant entered her womb through her right side. Finally, the elephant disappeared, and the queen awoke, knowing she had been delivered an important message, since the elephant is a symbol of greatness and auspiciousness in India. I think it's interesting to notice that there are some quite significant parallels between the traditional story of the pregnancy of the Buddha's mother and the story of the pregnancy of Mary, the mother of Jesus, in the Christian tradition. In both cases, the mother isn't inseminated by a human father, but rather by a supernatural entity bearing a white flower. In Mary's case, the supernatural entity is the angel Gabriel, and he comes bearing a white lily. Both women are regarded as virginal. In the story of Maya, it is said that, quote, when the Bodhisattva descended into his mother's womb, no thought of man associated with the 5 strands of sensual desires came to her at all, and she was inaccessible to any man with lustful mind. In other words, she was off limits, not interested. I don't want to get sidetracked in analyzing these stories' shared symbolism, so I'll leave that to you, but I did think it was worth pointing out. So, after the Buddha's birth, his mother dies, I would assume from childbirth-related complications. Interestingly, almost nothing is mentioned about the Buddha's life between the ages of 0 and 29. It's almost a total blank. There are only 2 brief stories. One story is that the Buddha remembers a significant meditation he once had under a rose apple tree while his father was performing a ceremonial plowing at the opening of the planting season. Now, some of you may be saying, wait, what about that story of how the Buddha's father imprisoned him in the palace to keep him sheltered from the pains of life, and how the Buddha saw the 4 messengers, an old person, a sick person, a corpse, dead person, and a renunciate, which caused his existential crisis and led him to the spiritual life? Well, yes, it's a famous story, often attributed to the Buddha, but the story isn't actually from his life at all. It's a later story attributed to another Buddha named Vipassi, who, according to the story, lived some eons ago. The only other information we're given about the Buddha's youth is his own description of the luxury he experienced growing up, and the 3 considerations, the 3 reminiscences that led him to the life of a renunciate. He describes his luxurious upbringing in this manner. He says, I was delicate, most delicate, supremely delicate. Lily pools were made for me at my father's house solely for my benefit. Blue lilies flowered in one, white lilies in another, red lilies in a third. I used no sandalwood that was not from Benares. Benares was like the Milan or the Paris of its day, a fashion center. My turban, tunic, lower garments, and cloak were all made of Benares cloth. It's like saying I only wore Armani. A white sunshade was held over me day and night, so that no cold or heat or dust or grit or dew might inconvenience me. That's like saying I wore my sunglasses at night. That's how cool I was. I had 3 palaces, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one for the rains. He's sounding an awful lot like the child of a billionaire, you know. I have a mansion in, we've got a place in Miami, we've got a penthouse in Manhattan, we've got a place in Los Angeles. In the Rains Palace, I was entertained by minstrels with no men among them. I had my own personal harem. I was a real player. I was a playboy. For the 4 months of the rains, I never went down to the lower palace. Though meals of broken rice with lentil soup are given to the servants and retainers in other people's houses, in my father's house white rice and meat was given to them. My father's servants ate like kings. we serve our servants foie gras. Then he says, whilst I had such power and good fortune, yet I thought, he has these three considerations, these three reminiscences. When an untaught ordinary man, who is subject to aging, not safe from aging, sees another who is aged, he is shocked, humiliated, and disgusted, for he forgets that he himself is no exception. I too am subject to aging, not safe from aging, so it cannot befit me to be shocked, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another who is aged. When I considered this, the vanity of youth left me entirely. He repeats that stock passage then with sickness and says, the vanity of health left me entirely, and then with death, and he concludes, the vanity of life left me entirely. The next chronological event in the canon is the Buddha's struggle for awakening. He set out to find the preeminent meditation teachers of his day in the hope that they would provide practices to assuage his existential angst. First, he encountered a teacher named Alara Kalama, who taught a very advanced meditative absorption called the ground of nothingness. In this particular meditative state, all the yogi perceives is a sense of nothingness, of absence, of something not being there. All bodily sensations, thoughts, and emotions are temporarily suspended. So, in that way, the absorption into nothingness entails a kind of temporary freedom from the existential angst and suffering that the Buddha wanted freedom from. Now, in the India of the Buddha's time, it was believed that when you entered these meditative states, your consciousness was literally being transported to an immaterial plane called the ground of nothingness. You were leaving this realm of form existence and going to a kind of formless realm, a heavenly realm where suffering was absent. And it was believed that if you hung out in this meditative state, if you went there often enough in this life, you would be reborn there after death, and after death your suffering would therefore have ended. The Buddha was such a good student that Alara Kalama requested the Buddha be his co-teacher. The Buddha said, thanks, but no thanks. What he was interested in was freedom from suffering in this lifetime, not after death. So he left the community. Following Alara Kalama, the Buddha went to another teacher, Udakaramaputa, who taught an even more refined meditative absorption, and who this time offered to turn his entire community over to the Buddha. But the Buddha's response was the same. Thanks, but no thanks. I want a resolution to my suffering in this lifetime, not after death. After these teachers, the Buddha switched tracks. He started living with some ascetics who had undertaken the practice of severe austerities, subjecting themselves to great physical hardships in order to overcome their creaturely needs and impulses, and, in theory anyway, to gain mastery of their bodies and their minds. As with the other trainings he had undertaken, the Buddha soon excelled his fellow ascetics in his commitment to the practice. This is how he described his experience with the austerities practice. He says, I thought, suppose with my teeth clenched and my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, I beat down, constrain, and crush my mind with my mind. I think a lot of young men who are learning how to meditate for the first time give that a try. Then, as a strong man might seize a weaker by the head or shoulders and beat him down, constrain him and crush him, so with my teeth clenched and my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, I beat down, constrained, and crushed my mind with my mind. Sweat ran from my armpits. And though tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness established, yet my body was overwrought and uncalm because I was exhausted by the painful effort. He goes on to describe just how deeply he went with these practices. He says, I thought, Suppose I take very little food, say a handful each time, whether it's of bean soup or lentil soup or pea soup. As I did so, my body reached a state of extreme emaciation. My limbs became like the jointed segments of vine stems or bamboo stems because I was eating so little. My backside became like a camel's hoof. The projections on my spine stood forth like corded beads. My ribs jutted out as gaunt as the crazy rafters of an old hoofless barn. The gleam of my eyes sunk far down in their sockets and looked like the gleam of water sunk far down in a deep well. My scalp shriveled and withered as a green gourd shrivels and withers in the wind and sun. If I touched my belly, I encountered my backbone, and if I touched my backbone, I encountered my belly, for my belly skin cleaved to my backbone. If I made water or evacuated my bowels, I fell over on my face there. If I tried to ease my body by rubbing my limbs with my hands, the hair, rotted at its roots, fell away from my body as I rubbed because of eating so little. That's quite powerful, evocative language, portraying a quite, in some ways, pathetic scene. One can't help but have compassion for this ardent yogi who isn't getting what he wants out of this practice. And he realized this. He concludes, I thought, whenever a monk or Brahmin has felt in the past, present, or future painful, racking, piercing feelings due to striving, it can equal this, but not exceed it. In other words, I've taken this practice as far as is humanly possible. Anybody who goes past this point dies. But by this grueling penance, I have attained no distinction higher than the human state, the typical human state. Might there be another way to enlightenment? So, the Buddha realizes that austerity practices were literally a dead end. And it's then that a memory from childhood arose in his mind, suggesting a possible alternate route to awakening. He remembers, I thought of a time when my Sakyan father was working, and I was sitting in the cool shade of a rose apple tree, quite secluded from sensual desires, secluded from unwholesome things. I had entered upon and abode in the first meditation, which is accompanied by applied and sustained attention, sometimes translated as thinking and exploring, with happiness and pleasure born of seclusion. I thought, might that be the way to enlightenment? Then, following up that memory, there came the recognition that yes, this was the way. Then I thought, why am I afraid of such pleasure? It is a pleasure that has nothing to do with sensual desires and unwholesome things. Then I thought, okay, I'm not afraid of such pleasure. It has nothing to do with sensual desires and unwholesome things, so I'm not afraid of it. Then he considers, it's not possible for me to attain that pleasure with a body that's so excessively emaciated, malnourished. Suppose I ate some solid food, some boiled rice and bread. Now, at that time, 5 ascetics were waiting on me, the ascetics with whom he was living, thinking, if the monk Gautama, Gautama was the Buddha's family name, and he was often referred to as the monk Gautama. If the monk Gautama achieves something, he'll tell us. As soon as I ate the solid food, the boiled rice and bread, the 5 bhikkhus were disgusted and left me, thinking, the monk Gautama has become self-indulgent. He's given up the struggle, and he's reverted to luxury. This particular reflection of the Buddha is extremely significant. It marks the first time he articulated for himself the idea of the middle way. The middle way, as many of you probably know, is a central concept in Buddhist training, in Buddhist teaching. The general idea suggested by the words middle way is one of avoiding extremes or unhelpful dualities. And the term gets used in many different ways in the Pali Canon and in later Buddhist literature. There are, after all, so many different ways that we fall into extremes or dualities. We'll talk more in depth about the middle way at another time, but for now, in this situation from the Buddha's life, we can see that he's thinking about the middle way as it pertains to the role of our relationship to pleasure and pain on the spiritual path. At this point in his life, the Buddha has a lot of first-hand experience with both the pursuit of pleasure as an end in itself and with the pursuit of pain as an end in itself. Recall the luxury of his youth. What he learned from that period of life was that pleasure doesn't lead to a reliable condition of happiness and existential ease. The young prince's personal harem, the multiple palaces at his disposal, the Gucci, the Armani, the gustatory delights of his father's table, these did nothing to assuage his anxiety about the inevitability of aging, sickness, and death. They weren't reliable sources of happiness because they could be taken away from him. Similarly, from his pursuit of ascetic practices, the Buddha learned that self-mortification, denying oneself pleasurable sensory experiences, plumbing the depths of pain, didn't lead to the kind of self-mastery and existential ease he had hoped for. With his childhood memory of a pleasureful meditative absorption, of a pleasurable state that doesn't entail grasping after the pleasure, I need to have that, the Buddha realizes that pleasure in and of itself isn't problematic. He realizes that the pleasure of that meditation wasn't entangled with, quote, sensual desires and unwholesome things, quote. In other words, he realizes the problem isn't pleasure or pain per se, but rather our relationship to them, whether or not desire is present with regard to pleasure, or whether or not aversion is present with regard to pain. When we desire something, we are unhappy when it's gone, when it's taken from us, we suffer. When we are averse to something, we are unhappy when it manifests, when it appears, we suffer. So he realized he could make skillful use of pleasure on the spiritual path by not letting himself become attached to it. He wouldn't have to suffer because of the meditative pleasure. And this was a very significant discovery, because pleasure, as it turns out, is an essential ingredient for achieving a mind that is concentrated, mindfully present, and therefore able to see phenomena clearly and objectively in order to acquire transformative insight. A mind that's overwhelmed by pain or bored by neutrality will not have the brisk and cheerful readiness and perseverance necessary to achieve the goal of insight. So, the Buddha regains his strength by eating some food. His ascetic companions abandon him, believing he's reverted to luxury. And he goes off to practice by himself. When he had recovered his strength, he sat near the bank of the Niranjan River in modern-day Bodh Gaya under a banyan tree, also known as the Bodhi tree. It's a kind of ficus religiosa. It has these lovely heart-shaped leaves. There, he entered into a series of pleasureful meditative absorptions in order to stabilize his mind and brighten his mindfulness. And then he applied that malleable and wieldy mind to achieving insight. The night of his enlightenment is described in numerous ways throughout the Pali Canon, as insight into the Four Noble Truths, into the workings of karma or intentional action, as insight into the structure of conditionality, and so forth. The reason there are so many descriptions of it is because what he realized is so profound that there can be no one way of putting it into words. It's as though the wisdom he attained were an infinitely multifaceted jewel, capable of being described from countless different angles or in terms of countless different facets. I won't say anything more right now about what the Buddha realized on that night, because in a manner of speaking, this entire course is dedicated to understanding what he realized and how he realized it. What's interesting is that after his awakening, the Buddha was initially disinclined to teach what he had realized. This is what he thought to himself. He thought, "This Dhamma that I have attained to is profound and hard to see, hard to discover. It is the most peaceful and superior goal of all, not attainable by mere thought, subtle for the wise to experience. But this generation relies on attachment, relishes attachment, delights in attachment. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth." And if it was hard for the Buddha's generation to see this truth, how much harder is it for our own generation? Each of us is steeped in the culture of capitalism, of commercialization from the time we're infants. As we drive down the street, we're bombarded by billboards. As we surf the web, we're bombarded by advertisements training us to want. When we enter into relationships, lover relationships with other people, we don't tend to view them as people. We tend to view them as commodities. What is this person's assets? What are my assets? What's the relative calculus between our assets? So, if it was hard for the Buddha's time, consider how much more difficult it might be in our age. It is hard for such a generation to see this truth. That is to say, specific conditionality, dependent arising. And it is hard to see this truth, that is to say, the stilling of all formations, relinquishing of the essentials of existence, exhaustion of craving, fading of lust, cessation, nibbana, in Sanskrit, nirvana. And if I taught the Dhamma, others would not understand me. But then he reconsiders. He realizes, but there are beings with, as he puts it, little dust on their eyes, who are so close to understanding, but just who have a little obscuration. And he says they're wasting away through not hearing the Dhamma. Some of them would gain final knowledge of the Dhamma. So he decides that he will teach, and the first people he will teach, those who are particularly ripe, are the really dedicated ascetics with whom he practiced previously. So he goes back to see them. When they see him approaching, they say to each other, "Oh, friends, here comes the monk Gautama, who became self-indulgent. He gave up the struggle. He reverted to luxury. Let's not pay homage to him. Let's not bow. But he's fine to sit down if he likes." However, despite their intention to give him the cold shoulder, his newfound air of serenity and peace and the convincing words he has to speak to them overcome their reluctance to speak with him. They become his first followers. It's said that this set the wheel of the Dhamma turning. At this point in his life, the Buddha was 35 years old. He'd spent roughly 6 years in pursuit of his goal and had finally achieved it. As it's told in the traditional biography, he spent the next 45 years of his life wandering around northern India and teaching and establishing monastic centers. At this point in his life, the Pali Canon abandons all chronology. The events of his middle and late decades are only mentioned incidentally in the context of various teachings which aren't arranged chronologically in the canon. The chronology only resumes in the last year of his life, which is recounted in the marvelous Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So in the last year of his life, his health is very poor. He experienced back pain and he had a continuous migraine. This is how he discusses his health with his attendant and cousin Ananda. He says, I love the Buddha's language. It's always so evocative. He was such a powerful such a powerful orator. He says, "Now I am old, Ananda. My years have turned 80. Just as an old cart is made to carry on with the help of makeshifts, so too, it seems to me, my body is made to carry on with the help of makeshifts. My body is only at ease when, with non-attention to all signs, and with cessation of certain kinds of feeling, I enter upon and dwell in the signless heart deliverance." In other words, he compares himself to a broken-down carriage that only gets around with temporary makeshift repairs before falling apart again. And he says the only time he isn't in chronic pain is when he enters a deep meditative state called cessation. Nevertheless, out of compassion, he continues to travel around northern India teaching with the help of his assistants. But we can tell that he knows his time is near. There are several instances where we find the Buddha saying goodbye to cities or locations that have featured prominently in his life. For example, this is how he says goodbye to the city of Vaisali. "When it was morning, the Blessed One," that's an epithet for the Buddha, "the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went into Vaisali for alms. When he had wandered for alms in Vaisali, and was returning from his alms round after his meal, he turned to gaze at Vaisali with," it says, "the elephant's gaze, an elephant's gaze. Then he said to the Venerable Ananda, 'Ananda, this will be my last sight of Vaisali. Come, Ananda, let us go.'" I like that terminology, the terminology of the elephant's gaze. I imagine him looking at Vaisali kind of like this, surveying the city. To me, the term elephant's gaze communicates a sense of quiet, reflective appreciation for the history of a certain place, for his history and his order's history of with a certain location. Something that's interesting to note, and the reason for which we will discuss when we look at the Buddha's life the second time round, is how in the last year of his life, he didn't reside in any of his regular haunts, the major urban centers around which he built his Sangha, around which he had to build his Sangha because he had a large population of followers, and they needed to receive enough alms to feed themselves, and so he had to be around a large population of townspeople. So he didn't stay at any of his usual locations. Rather, he stayed for an extended period of time in the grove of a famous courtesan, and he wandered for the remainder of the year in forests and in the countryside. In this year, also, his two chief disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, preceded him in death. Sariputta, regarded as the wisest of all his disciples, succumbed to an illness, while Moggallana, the disciple regarded as the chief master of the powers of meditation, was savagely beaten to death by some assassins hired by misbehaved followers of a different religious sect. The Buddha's last meal was provided by the son of a humble goldsmith named Kunda. Kunda served a meal that translates as boar's delight, which might have been pork, or it could have been the mushrooms that boars eat. Which it was isn't clear, but either way, once the Buddha begins eating it, he realizes the meal is spoiled, and he asks Kunda to bury it in the ground so that no one else after him eats it. Shortly thereafter, the Buddha suffers a bout of severe dysentery, and although he's extremely weak, he decides to continue traveling on to a town roughly 6 miles away called Kusinara. And because in his compassion he doesn't want people to blame Kunda for his illness, the Buddha points out to his cousin and attendant Ananda that Kunda's motivations in wanting to feed the Buddha were entirely wholesome. He wasn't, intentionally trying to poison him or anything. So Buddha and Ananda and the small group of monks they were with make it to the field outside of Kusinara, but the Buddha can go no further. He has to stop. He lies down on his side like this between two solid trees. It's said the two trees were covered in blossoms through the influence of the devas, the celestial spirits, even though it wasn't the season for flowers. The flowers were said to fall and scatter on the Buddha as a sign of the respect and honor that nature herself held the Buddha in. A little while later, people noticed that Ananda, the Buddha's attendant and cousin, he'd been his attendant for some decades, so they were very close, was nowhere to be found. They went looking for him, and they found him inside a hut. He was leaning against the door bar, weeping. The Buddha gently consoled him, saying, quote, "Enough now, Ananda. Do not sorrow and cry. Have I not repeatedly told you that there is separation and parting from all that is dear and beloved? How is it possible that anything that has been born, has had a beginning, should not again die? Such a thing is not possible. Ananda, you have served me with your acts of loving kindness, helpfully, gladly, sincerely, and so too in your words and your thoughts. You have gained merit, Ananda. Keep on trying, and soon you will be completely free from suffering." Ananda pulls himself together. He goes into the town of Kusinara to gather up some followers of the Buddha so they can pay their last respects to him. One of these is a wanderer named Subhadda. Subhadda, who has never studied the Buddha's Dharma but is passionate to learn, is distraught upon learning that the Buddha's about to die. He wants to learn the Dhamma directly from the Master. So he asks Ananda if he can receive some teachings from the Buddha. Understandably, Ananda turns him away, saying, "Look, can't you see the Buddha is dying? Now isn't a good time." But the Buddha, from his deathbed, overhears Subhadda's request and grants him an audience. In fact, the Buddha's last act on earth was to give teachings to this man, which I think shows the Buddha's immense love and compassion for all beings, his tireless effort to spread the teachings and awaken as many people as possible, even on his deathbed. Finally, when the Buddha realizes he is about to take his last breath, he exhorts his audience one last time. "Remember, everyone, it is the nature of all formations to dissolve. Everything that arises passes away. Work out your own salvation with diligence." Then, it's said he enters upon a series of deep meditative absorptions, perhaps as a final goodbye to the meditative realms that he knew so well, before passing into final nibbana, the final extinction of all suffering. Now, the Buddha was adamant that no one person should take control of the order after his death. In fact, an alternate translation of his last words could be a light unto yourself." That is, he felt the Dhamma itself, the teachings themselves, should be people's guides, as opposed to some external human authority or guru. Following the Buddha's death, a large council of his foremost disciples was convened. The objective of this council was to preserve the Buddha's teachings, the Dharma, or in the Pali language, the Dhamma, as well as to preserve the rules of the monastic discipline, the Vinaya, for future generations. Ananda, who had a prodigious memory, recounted what he had heard the Buddha preach, which is why every sutta in the canon begins with the words, "Thus have I heard." Once the disciples had agreed on the material presented, that it was in fact what the Buddha has said, that it did accurately represent his Dhamma, they went their separate ways. Since Indian society at the time was largely pre-literate, there would be periodic Buddhist councils over the next centuries to repeatedly confirm the accuracy and consistency of the teachings being passed down. They were finally committed to writing at the Fourth Buddhist Council, held in Sri Lanka in 29 BCE.